Hi, this is Matt, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jam Along, the podcast for anyone and everyone who loves bluegrass. My guest on Bluegrass Jam Along this week is George Jackson. George was IBMA Momentum Instrumentalist of the Year in 2022. He is an awesome fiddle player, and I have it on good authority. He was a competitive Highland dancer until the age of 21. But neither of those things are what we're going to talk about today, because George has been working with Tristan Scroggins on a project to record 100 old-time tunes in a day and release them, and that is a fascinating thing to talk about. So, George, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Matt. Yes, it's true. I did Highland dancing for a long time, but that's all I'll say.
Wonderful. Well, I'm not going to ask you about that, so don't worry. I mean, the obvious first question is, why did you record 100 fiddle tunes in the space of a day?
I know. It's an absolutely crazy prospect, and something that I personally probably wouldn't have ever thought to do myself. But we're all very lucky that Tristan Scroggins has much more interesting ideas than I do. So I guess he sent round a message to a bunch of friends and was like, I want to record 100 tunes in a day. And we were all just like, that's crazy. Why would we do that? And he was looking for people to maybe go in on it with him, financially and otherwise. And it didn't take me long to sort of figure out that would actually be a really great project to be involved in. Because both Tristan and I run these like lessons platforms, and a list of 100 jammable tunes is a really valuable resource. So I just decided I was the only crazy, slightly less crazy person, but crazy enough to jump on board with Tristan with the idea. So we started working on it together. But the secret is that we didn't quite record it all in one day. I think it was about a week before we were going to do the big session, and I was like, I really think that we should try and get a head start on this stuff, because that's so many tunes. I started doing the math. I was like, if it takes us 5 minutes to record one tune, and we have 5 minutes in between or whatever, I started like doing the math on that, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is a really long time. So I think we got together like a night before, or maybe it was 2 nights before the big session, and we just sort of got as many done at our engineer's house as we could, which I think we ended up doing 22 that first night, and then 78 in the big session, which is still an absurd number.
Yeah. And I read somewhere that you recorded that big session at James Key's house in his living room.
We did, yeah. James was gracious enough, I guess, to think that this was a fun idea also, and was down for us to use his space. And we, something that Tristan really wanted to have be a part of this project was have it be kind of a organic, like house party jam, not a sterile recording environment. So it really was still functioning as a house. James's roommates were coming and going, and people were cooking food and in the space we were recording, and friends were coming and going, playing a few tunes, dropping in, playing a few tunes, heading out again, all day long. So there's tons of sort of Nashville picker friends that are peripherally playing along as well.
And it's interesting because these are like, particularly it's old time tunes, isn't it? Rather than bluegrass. That's the angle you've gone for. And there's such a strong thread of that music being social music anyway. To a certain extent,
it's fundamental. Yeah.
And so there's something about, I mean, they sound. I've heard the first 20 which you put out so far, and they sound great. It doesn't sound like somebody's stuck a mic up and taped to jam in a pub or somebody's kitchen. It sound they sound great, and it's balanced, and it's it's clean, and it's all there. But it's definitely got a kind of group feel about it.
Yeah, and certainly it's not the sort of thing that I've ever done it in a recording session before, where there's literally only one chance, because we just didn't have time, I think a couple of tunes we might have there might have been a big enough mistake where we started it again or whatever, but that was very rare. Most of the time it was any mistake was kind of well, that's going to be on there. So there's plenty of funny bits, but it's funny when in that sort of setting, in a sort of old time jam setting, you don't really hear most of that. It comes and goes so quickly, and it's just part of the group din, that's happening. And no one really hears that in a jam session either. It's just part of it, and it makes it more authentic sounding, I guess.
Well, it's really interesting because people like me who are learning to play instruments, one of the biggest hurdles people have to get over to go to a jam is this fear of making mistakes and getting it wrong. And, and that's not the point at all, is it? But that's, so many of us are afraid of that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But of course, the only way to learn is to make mistakes, so... Yeah, I often encourage students that are working with me, that you have to put yourself in those situations and get used to making mistakes in front of people, because that's the only way it's going to happen. It's the only way you're going to move forward.
And there's an educational element to this. You're talking about putting them on your sort of teaching site, and Tristan's putting mandolin versions of them on his as well. And was there a sort of particular reason with the old time? And I don't know enough about this, but is there plenty of opportunity out there to hear decent educational recordings of bluegrass tunes and modern recordings of bluegrass tunes? Is finding old time stuff a bit more difficult?
That's an interesting, this is there's so many directions to go with this question. I think there's less tunes that are jam standards in bluegrass, because people spend a lot of time learning to solo over those tunes, and soloing is a big it takes a lot of time, so when you're focusing on playing old time music, you're focusing on the groove and the bowings and all of that sort of stuff. But the tune is the tune. And once you've learnt that, you tend to move on and learn a new tune. And, while you're working on all of these groove elements or bowing elements or whatever, and moving on and learning a new tune can really help you come back to the one that you were learning before with a new lens too. I guess part of the barrier to entry for old time music specifically is that when you're new to playing old time music, I think it can be really daunting to know which tunes to learn. And then when you go find those tunes, or people are like, go listen to Tommy Jarrell or go listen to these old fiddlers, the recordings that you're listening to are kind of challenging to listen to when you're not used to finding the gold in it. They're not up to modern recording standards, the playing isn't smooth, it's rough, and I think there's plenty of examples in bluegrass music of really beautiful sounding standard jammers. I think that's something that Tristan and I took a lot of inspiration from, is the series that Scott Vestal did, Bluegrass 95, 96, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many great standards. Both me and him sort of grew up listening to those recordings, and they are a really great example of like, wow, if you want to hear a good version of Forked Deer, with Aubrey Haney just slaying the fiddle, like that, there's going to be all of those standards on that series. And they're beautifully recorded. I think that we wanted to sort of create a lower barrier of entry, like some nice sounding recordings that people who aren't used to listening to these challenging, scratchy fiddle recordings, which I really love. I personally really love them, but it took me a long time to learn to love them. I didn't love them at first. I definitely was like, this doesn't sound very good, and it's hard to learn from. So when people are like, oh, there's an old time jam in my community and, I want to go along and I want to learn some tunes, and maybe they don't want to listen to some scratchy fiddlers because they're not kind of used to that yet. They haven't sort of found their way into that yet. Maybe this is a better way in or a nice way in. There's some nice recordings. They sound good. It's all of the jam standards that you're going to need, probably more than you'll be able to get through in a while. Yeah. And, not all of them are going to be played at your jam, and maybe, but there'll be enough crossover. And so I think that was, I think that kind of covers some of the directions I wanted to go with that question.
Well, yeah. No, there's quite a lot of stuff in there to unpick. And just, one of the things I hadn't thought about is, of course, there are lots of versions of the Bluegrass tunes because every new generation of pickers comes along, wants to put their stamp on them because there is so much improvisation. So you can take them anywhere. So you can listen to...
Yeah, totally. And also because, like, a lot of the players will be playing the same tunes that have already been recorded. It's Cherokee Shuffle, Forked Deer, like Gold Rush. There'll be all of these... and there's a big list of bluegrass standard tunes, as we know. Like, it's not a small list, but they do tend to get recycled because people want to put their spin on it. And I guess that there is a core sort of like collection of old time standards as well, which is kind of what we were getting at with the like here's 100. And people are, likewise, I guess, putting their spin on it or re-recording those. But they're maybe a little more scattered, but certainly something that is valued. It's a little bit of a joke that I tell in my performances a lot of the time is something that's really valued in old time music is where in most settings, like people will sort of be like, play something we know. And old time music, the sort of cool kid thing to do is like, so play something we don't know. If you're playing, like, you're really cool if you're playing these like really obscure, interesting versions that no one's heard before. So that can be kind of intimidating.
Yeah, and it took me a while to get my head around when I started listening to this music to sort of understand what the differences between bluegrass and old time were. And the obvious thing is that, old time feels much more to me like Irish music, where the melodic instruments play the tune many times, everybody else backs them up, and you might put tunes together in sets, but you're not kind of wandering off improvising around them and go around the circle and everybody takes a break. It's much more of a collective, and it's like you were saying before, it's much more about a groove and a sort of collective feel than individual playing, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Although certainly one of my pet subjects is, like, I love to challenge the notion that old time and bluegrass music are fundamentally that different. Like, they're kind of the same in a lot of ways. I mean, look, there's lots that is different about them, but there's lots that's the same. And especially when you get back to a certain time in music before bluegrass was like a named genre. There's plenty of banjo players that were playing with picks in old time music, I think the sort of revival in the 60s and 70s really brought about the clawhammer sort of, this is what old time music is. But, there's lots of picked banjo. There's lots of, like kind of flat picked guitar backup, there's all sorts of stuff in there that's really similar. And when you listen to like Michael Cleveland slaying an awesome bluegrass fiddle tune, it's all about groove. And that's kind of an old time aesthetic, I don't know. There's lots that I like to kind of, I don't know, just, I guess I like to challenge the idea that they're very clearly defined as like separate things, when there certainly was a time when that was less so. And, because bluegrass wasn't a named genre and was only just sort of beginning, the only fiddlers that were around were fiddlers that played old time music. So like, bluegrass music kind of absorbed old time music as a part of it. Like Kenny Baker, when you listen to some of his records, he doesn't solo on a lot of the tunes. He just plays the tune over and over. That's old time music, Why is that not old time music? It kind of is. So, and one of the funny things that I notice when I go to old time music conventions is that, it's become really popular to kind of play really early bluegrass at those places, a way in which like a type of bluegrass music that you don't really hear at bluegrass festivals so often. You get this funny thing where maybe people are playing bluegrass music a little closer to how early Bill Monroe and Stanley Brothers, etc., did at old time music conventions, and then at IBMA and bluegrass music conventions. The sort of like very cool thing to do is to play clawhammer banjo and play old time fiddle tunes. Yeah. So things start getting real muddled up.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And I was going to ask because, like, and maybe you've unpicked a bit of that there, and maybe this question doesn't make so much sense, but I'm curious as to whether the instrumental roles differ slightly between what people think of as bluegrass and old time, because just the idea of Tristan playing the melodies, is there traditionally a melodic role for an instrument like mandolin? And like, would the guitar be generally a backup instrument in old time? And is there a sort of stylistic difference in the way people play stuff beyond the ornamentation and the rhythms and things? Is there like the actual role of the instruments? Does that differ that much? We'll be right back with you just after this. Bluegrass Jamalong is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins. If you're attending the NAMM show in January, stop by the Collings booth to say hello to the team, get hands-on with their selection of customised acoustics and electrics, and check out some exciting new prototypes they're working on for 2024. They'll also have a few of their world-class artists on hand demoing various instruments. And if you can't attend, don't forget to follow their Instagram and Facebook accounts throughout the show for photos, videos, and the latest news. Collings guitars are hand-built from the Sound Up in Austin, Texas. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. If one of your 2024 resolutions is to improve as a musician, Peghead Nation is the place to go. They have 65 streaming video courses for guitar, mandolin, banjo, fiddle, dobro, bass, and ukulele from some of the leading names in acoustic music. Courses cover bluegrass, old time, Irish music and swing, plus lessons dedicated to improvisation, theory and ear training. Your first course is just $20 a month, and you can add more for $10. Try any course free for a month with the promo code JAMALONG. Make 2024 a year of more music at pegheadnation.com.
Yeah, slightly. I did a little live stream with Tristan the other day when we released the album, actually, and it was so fun playing with him. And we were sort of talking about how he plays the mandolin, like what the function is in an old time setting. And he's kind of like playing bits of the melody and kind of playing bits of chords he's not really chopping so much, kind of shuffling along, but like catching bits of the melody in different octaves. Really strikes me as like almost the role of a banjo player in an old time music setting, because like, you know, the classic sort of situation when you're playing with a fiddle and a banjo is that the banjo is kind of playing the melody, but they're also kind of playing the chords, and it's somewhere in between. And that's what really makes it cool is, you know, it's neither just purely melodic or purely backup. It's somewhere in the middle. It's chord. It can be chordal. It can be rhythmic and melodic at the same time. And that's really complementary. And I think that's kind of how Tristan plays during this Old Time 100 session. As for the other instruments, yeah, like guitar generally is just playing chordal backup, which is kind of what the guitar was doing in bluegrass music when it first arrived. You know, it wasn't until much later that guitars started playing solos. So whether or not you even want to call guitar soloing traditional bluegrass or not, you know, is a debate, and that furthers my assertion that bluegrass is old time and old time is bluegrass. You know, but bass is a big part of old time music these days, but you really hear it. Sorry, with my New Zealand accent, rarely kind of feel like I need to, not really, REALLY, RARELY, rarely hear bass on like any sort of source recordings. So it's kind of a newer thing, maybe in some ways kind of brought in by, you know, the popularity of like bluegrass ensembles and you know, so it's interesting to see how, you know, old time sometimes gives this impression that it's like this timeless, like, you know, archaic style, but, you know, it changes. It's modernized too. And I think bass is part of that. Mandolin, you know, there's not a ton of mandolin in old time recordings, but, you know, if you listen to the classic Ed Haley recordings, his wife, Ella Haley, is playing mandolin a lot of the time. And there's other examples of mandolin playing in old time music too, just like there is with like, you know, piano and accordion in old time music, which, you know, you don't really see at old time conventions. And yeah, the fiddle is generally just playing the melody. There's definitely little bits of improvisation that kind of happen, you know, variations. Am I missing anything from the instrument list here?
Makes
banjo?
sense. Yeah, we talked about that sort of rhythm melody style. I guess it's an interesting thing given that old time music was often social music for people to dance to, and that's kind of what these tunes were for. I guess you just would play with the instrument. You might have 3 fiddles and 2 banjos. You might, like this idea of a bluegrass band being 5 instruments with specific roles is a relatively new thing. But with an old time, you might end up with 4 fiddle players or, you know, 2 banjo players. And I probably was rare to have a bass. And so if you had one, you had one, but you didn't kind of go, well, we can't do this without one. You just, whoever was there played for whoever wanted to dance.
Yeah. This actually gets at one of the things that I really think is a distinction between old time and music. What you kind of mentioned with old time music being like primarily social and dance oriented music. Really, like when bluegrass music kind of came along, it's like the advent of radio. You know, it's like all of a sudden the function of the music is to be entertainment that's purely for listening across, you know, broadcast. And so things needed to be changed slightly. You know, you had to make things maybe a little snappier and flashier because, you know, people are sitting there listening. And they're not dancing or they're not making music with you. They're just listening. So, maybe you're not going to play the tune 20 times around. You're going to play 3 or 4 times, and you're going to use more variation, or, like the sort of beginnings of soloing, or, the banjo is going to have a feature. That's the way I see like old time music kind of morphing into something that became bluegrass, is sort of the function of the music, the primary function of the music, kind of like shifting focus, and then you get this kind of funny thing that's happening now, which is old time music as performance music, right? So like when I'm performing with my band, Tall Poppy String Band, or other like Foghorn String Band are playing a show for people, they have to make old time music entertaining in a way, and that moves it away from its sort of like social and dance function. And that's why it starts being like, well, like this is kind of bluegrass now, right? Because the function is what became bluegrass. How do you keep people's attention interested when they're not dancing or not engaging in playing music with you? So that's really interesting.
Yeah, and they say it sort of makes me laugh, that whole kind of debate about whether people should dance at bluegrass gigs or not, or like if the music makes you want to move your feet. But no, we're all sitting in our seats and we can't see if you'll get up and dance. And it's like it's such a full circle conversation to have. But this music that sort of came out of the need for people to have music to dance to, because there wasn't the radio or records, or if you wanted music, you needed people who could play music.
Totally. Yeah. But I think that's kind of why bluegrass music is like generally considered not particularly danceable, because it, like its function was, at least, in the early bluegrass bands, its function really was entertainment on the radio, or, on recorded music. But yeah, you also get this funny thing now where, like the sort of danceable types of bluegrass music, which is like the jamgrass, right? And others, they bring in these sort of other danceable elements, infusing it with bluegrass and bluegrass lineups. It's kind of like reconnecting the old time part, but like through a different avenue, perhaps, because you've got other types of dance music influence coming in, whether it's like rock and roll or
it's really cool. And one of the things you touched on there was we talked about the sort of bluegrass tunes and old time tunes. And when I first started learning tunes, the thing I found most frustrating, which in the end I realized was liberating, was working out what that actual tune is. Because if you want like a jazz standard, there's probably some original sheet music around from whenever it was written, or it came from like a Gershwin show or whatever. So there's like there sort of is a version of the melody. But trying to like you talk about those like Bluegrass 95, 96, 97 records as a good source for fairly straight versions of the tunes. But, I'd be really interested to know, like, A, how you chose the 100 tunes you chose, but also was there some pressure to choose, like, air quotes that nobody can see because this is a podcast, like correct versions if people are going to learn these and play them at a jam? Are they learning versions that, I find that fascinating.
Yeah, totally. No, this is a great question. When Tristan and I were sort of conceiving of this whole idea, Tristan basically emailed a bunch of his friends. I love the way that Tristan's brain works. And, he really wanted to check in with a bunch of people. He created this like Google survey where basically he just he asked people all around the country, like what are common tunes played at your local jam, and they sort of filled it in, and he basically picked the 100 tunes from sort of this data that he collected, this sort of amateur statistics data, collection that, so he sort of came to me with this list, and then I was like looking at this list and I was like, okay, so we've got the name of a tune, Big Sciota or 8th of January or something. And it's like, which version are we going to play of this tune? Because, we're trying to make a collection of tunes that people can take to their jam session. So maybe we want to sort of keep it towards standard versions, but then also, like there was certainly times when I was like, well, I really like this other version that's slightly out of the list. So then, we could maybe potentially play a little bit of a tastemaker and like encourage people to play these other versions. Because if they're learning that from us, then maybe we can also slightly influence. So it was definitely trying to balance. But I took on the job of essentially assigning like a source recording reference to each of the 100 tunes. So I went through and like picked a version of the tune that we were essentially going to like base our version from, or, like have as a reference point at the very least. Most of the time I tried to sort of hew that close to a version that people would likely play, so not like the most obscure, like, extra bar, or, 3-4 part extra, like weird Kentucky version of a tune, but something that, like maybe if there is a version of a tune, that you hear people jam a lot at these local jams, where did that version come from? Where did that, what's a version of that sort of sounds like it was passed on from? So I tried to sort of mostly do that, but there's certainly some outliers where I was like, well, but I like this version, so I'm gonna make that. But yeah, I think I think that it's we're playing a little bit of tastemaker, trying to also sort of keep it recognizable, but also, if people use it as a jumping off point and then they go and learn a version that they prefer, or it encourages them to be like, well, that's not how it sounds at my jam, so like I'm gonna look into this. I don't know. That can all only be good stuff, I think.
Yeah, no, I think it is all really interesting because it's, it's that idea that even just with improvising slightly around the melody, you can create a version of the tune that is yours, and you probably play it slightly differently each time you play it, and all of that is really liberating. And with the kind of fixing the harmony of these tunes, because there's probably several ways you can harmonize some of them. Like even at a bluegrass jam, just going and playing something like Old Joe Clark, whether people like, if you play an A, whether people play a G in certain places or a D behind some stuff, it's, it's not always the same. And
in old time music, it's E, or the E chord, and never the G. Yeah.
And because there is sort of, we were talking before about how often you'd have a bunch of melody instruments, and maybe guitar is a relatively new thing compared to a lot of these instruments. And the idea, I've had conversations on the podcast before, this idea that once guitar came along, it slightly fixed the harmonic structure of things in the way that were a bit more amorphous before and a little bit more nebulous, and you could, and like you said, with the banjo playing sort of chords and melody, and often things can feel slightly modal. It doesn't always have to be a lockdown thing, the harmony of a tune, but as soon as you put chords behind it, and I find that really interesting as well. And when you sit down, presumably without hours to rehearse these tunes together, do you tend to find you're on the same page with them pretty quickly?
Yeah, we would sort of have this like very quick routine before recording each tune, which was I would sort of like play the reference recording so that we kind of know what version we're trying to deal with, and then we'd have a quick discussion about chords. And absolutely, one of the things that I find really fascinating about chords is there's no one right way to harmonize something, right? Because when you play a note, it can be a part of a chord or a color on top of a chord in any number of ways. So we would often sort of choose, there would be a discussion, particularly between the bassist Eli Broxham and Amy Alvey, who was playing guitar, and Frank Evans, who was playing banjo, and Tristan too, on the mandolin, of course. Least input from me playing the fiddle. I was just kind of concentrating on playing the melodies, but they would sort of have a bit of a discussion. What chords are we going to play behind this? And there's various structures that are really common in old time music. Missouri rules, which is kind of like a series of 1-4, 1-5. That's really common. That like sort of in traditional like old time fiddling from that region, they'll just play behind any tune. It's kind of become this particular style, which is really fun and cool. It's a cool sound. So they would be like, okay, it's Missouri rules in the B part. We're going to go to the 4 chord here, or so we'd have to make quick decisions. Basically, are we going to go to the 6 minor, or are we going to go to the 4? Those are often interchangeable. We're going to go to the 5 or the 2 minor here. Are we going to are we going to try and keep it like super traditional sounding, where there's generally just like a 5 chord or a 4 chord, but like in more sort of modern recordings, you might use like a flat 7 or a 6 minor or a 2 minor as more sort of colorful chords. So we would just kind of make those calls, and sometimes we went with the traditional option, sometimes we went with the more modern option, and we had 100 tunes, so like it runs the gamut. It's just like, are we feeling bored right now? Do we want to add some minor chords in for fun? Have we been holding the A chord for too long?
Well, it's also interesting just with like with these tracks, the first 20 that are out now, there's bits of vocal on there as well, but it's very much vocal that kind of comes out of the ensemble rather than somebody on a mic singing a lead vocal.
Yeah, totally. A lot of these tunes, a lot of these melodies also have song elements, obviously, like it's not song in the way that we think of, singer-songwriter songs, but, like there's verses to a lot of these tunes. And it's really fun to, we didn't actually have anyone set up with a vocal mic. So when you hear the vocals come in, it's usually Frank or Amy kind of shouting verses out. It's coming through their instrumental microphones, but that just adds to the sort of jammy aesthetic and the sort of authentic, jam session that it was. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love it. It sounds great that way. And I think it's what I like about these recordings is they've got a kind of collective energy and a groove, and it's the way they're recorded really suits it and the way they're played. And I remember talking to Tristan about this project quite a while ago when I interviewed him for something else. And, he's sort of saying that they were recorded quickly, and there's, he didn't necessarily know all the tunes as they were being recorded, and I think I've heard him say somewhere that like you took a break from them and then came back and listened to them, and were sort of surprised how good they were.
Yeah, definitely,
because they do sound great.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we were certainly pretty surprised, when we came back around and we finally like these. One thing that we've come to learn, which, maybe we should have known, is that 100 tunes is a lot of digital material, and it's a lot of money to produce that many tracks, right? So there was a long time where we'd basically paid for the initial session and we kind of put it on the back burner, and, we just had these... I think Jake Stagel, who was recording it, just had the tape rolling the whole time, So we just had these massive long audio files that weren't cut up into the 100 tunes that they were. So we had to get Jake to sort of go through and make rough cuts of all of them, identify where the start and finish of any tune is. And so then we got those rough cuts back, and you're sort of listening through them. Well, this, as I said before, we're only doing about one take, maybe every 30 or something. We'd stop one and give it another go or something. But these are coming and going so quickly, and they all just sort of blend into one, and you're never really sure whether or not it's sounding that good, I guess. But, it feels good in a jam sort of setting, but you're not sure what it's going to sound like as a recording. But we were certainly pleasantly surprised. And I guess, we hired some great musicians. So, I think Frank Evans, the banjo player, such a great musician, really good friend of mine. He's the only musician that actually stayed the course, plays on all 100 of the tracks. Wow. I there was one tune that I hadn't learned very well, and Rafe Stefanini played that by himself because he was there. And so I'm on 99, and Frank's on 100, and I think Tristan played some bass on some, and Casey Campbell played some mandolin on some. So he's not playing mandolin on all 100, but Frank managed to beat us all across the line.
It'd be really interesting to talk a little bit about the educational element and the kind of. So we talked a lot about stylistic stuff and the music and the process, but I'm really interested in, because you invested this time and this money in making these things, about where they're going to sit and what how people will interact with them, because they're there as people can go and just listen to them, and that's great, but there's so much more, isn't there? There's video content and sort of transcriptions and ways people can actually use this to learn these tunes.
Totally. Yeah I think the educational element is fundamental to this project. That's the bedrock that we were building this on. So we saw this sort of project as something that would be really valuable to people looking to know what tunes to learn, because that is such a overwhelming thing to come to when you're just starting out in old time music. It's there's all of these tunes, and which ones do you learn, and where do you learn them from? I think we're so it's so amazing these days that we have access to things like streaming music on Spotify or YouTube or whatever. But back in the day, at least you just had to learn what you had access to. Now, when you say that you're going to learn old time music, you have access to literally everything in your pocket. So that's overwhelming. It's just so daunting sometimes to where do you start? So we kind of thought, this is a great great thing for people who want to know where to start. Like, well, here's a list of 100. That's going to keep you busy for a while. And, I don't know if people will learn all 100 of these, but like if they learn 5 or 10 and it starts them off and they discover some other recordings from there or some other tunes or versions or whatever, that's great, So yeah, like we'll release all of this stuff publicly eventually. It's going to take us a while. We're sort of releasing it in 5 volumes of 20 tracks as we sort of get them produced. But on our Patreon pages, we have, we're doling out like 5 new tracks every month to subscribers there. So there's, as of this month, 50 tracks available. And they're in like rough edit like format rather than like mixed and mastered like the first 20 are. Eventually, we'll get them all mixed and mastered, but that just takes time and money. And we haven't, quite got that all there yet. So, we're doling it out in little bits to our Patreon pages. We're producing video content. Like I recorded myself playing these tunes, all 100 of them, on my iPhone, sort of in an overhead position so that people can see my left hand and my right hand and maybe get ideas on like how to use the bow and, where my fingers are going down and like how I'm double stopping or whatever they might find interesting. So, there's all that video content that comes along with it. And, I've just released the first video of that publicly on my YouTube channel as well. So, I will be sort of doling out bits of that publicly as we go as well. And then also, we're writing out like music notation and tablatures, so that if that's something that is important to the way that you learn and that you would make things easier for you. And I've always been like a strong encourager of ear learning, learning tunes by ear for bluegrass music and old time music or any sort of folk music. But, there's certainly times where, having a look at the sheet music to give you an idea about maybe bowing or, what notes are coming in if you're finding it difficult to work out a particular passage or something. All of that stuff's there. So we're sort of trying to have as much educational content from this as people could ever imagine.
And so the best places for people to come to find this stuff, is it, I presume, your Patreon page for fiddle versions and Tristan's for mandolin versions? Totally,
yeah. Yeah, and if you're not a fiddle player or a mandolin player, either one. So there'll still be stuff on these Patreon pages that are totally applicable. I have music notated, like written out versions that can be used, or you can slow down any of these tunes and on YouTube and learn them flat on your flat pick guitar or whatever. So yeah,
cool. And presumably they're there as kind of people come and buy them on Bandcamp or wherever as well to buy the tunes.
Yeah, so we sort of have all of that stuff available to patrons on our Patreon pages for $5. That's the sort of barrier to entry for any of the old time 100 stuff. But if you're not doing that sort of subscription stuff and you want to just buy volume 1, it's available on Bandcamp. It's also available anywhere, on all the streaming music and stuff. And I guess, it's a little bit the honors system and we're just trying to get it out to as many people that it would be helpful to as possible. But if, it's in your price range and it's in your and you're getting something out of it, then maybe subscribe to Patreon for a month or two, and or buy it off Bandcamp. If you're finding value in it, that's where we're sort of going with it.
Cool. I mean, just listening to them, I've been listening to them sort of this week. They've been in my head as I've been wandering around doing things, and there's some tunes in there that I didn't know, lots of tunes I didn't know, and it's certainly made me want to learn some of them. And I think that point you made about how much stuff there is in the world, and the possibility, anything that curates a selection of things for us, I think is becoming more and more valuable, because, and that's, one of the traditional roles of a teacher is to, you can go on any site, on YouTube, wherever, there's endless things about learning how to play your instrument. But then it's up to you to find the meaningful ones, and having somebody just guide you and go, look, here's a selection of tunes, here's some versions of these tunes, and here's how to play them. It's a really invaluable thing, because you could flounder for hours and weeks and months and years on your own looking for this stuff. And I think it's great to have, a hand-picked selection.
Absolutely. And, even the other end of that is with the access to everything that we have access to, you could end up going on finding some things that you really like that no one else knows.
Yeah.
And, here's a list of tunes that, we're pretty sure, most of these are going to be known at a lot of jams, So, it's a curated list of hey, whether you're in the UK or the US or New Zealand, a lot of these tunes are shared. And if you're an old time musician, and honestly, as I sort of talked about earlier, old time music kind of being part of the fabric of bluegrass music, part of what went into, one of the main ingredients in the development of bluegrass music. A lot of these tunes are also bluegrass tunes, or tunes that are played in bluegrass music. And if you're interested in finding out where these tunes came from, that this is also, that it's kind of digging deeper into, the roots of bluegrass.
And there's a whole other conversation you can go off on that route and talk about, the tune, and then some of the sort of British, Scots, Irish history of some of it, and the same tunes having different names. And there's a whole, you could go on for hours, and I find all that really interesting. But it's been really cool listening to them, and I'm definitely going to learn some. And it's been really interesting talking about them. Thanks for coming on.
That's awesome, Matt. Yeah, this was a great conversation. Yeah.
Bluegrass Jamalong is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins, making some of the finest guitars and mandolins in the world since the 1970s. Visit collingsguitars.com and find out why.